Hi, I'm Bob Morwell, pastor of Union United Methodist Church in Quincy, Illinois, and this is episode 15 of our online study of the Gospel according to Luke. In this installment, we pick up with Luke chapter 6, verse 6. Jesus has already had a run-in with some of the most conservative Pharisees over the nature of the Sabbath. He's quoted as assuming the title of Son of Man, which evoked writings of the Jewish prophets about a figure who was human, but also had a special divine mission. He then claims that the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath, which really asserted his claim of divine authority. He then presses this point by healing a man with a withered hand. Now, even the most hard-nosed fundamentalist Pharisees did not ban all healing on the Sabbath. If someone's life was in danger or they were in terrible pain, it was considered a higher righteousness to tend to that person's suffering no matter how much work that entailed. But this particular healing falls outside of that paradigm. The man in question has apparently had a useless hand for some time and is not in any particular pain, nor is his life in danger because of it. Man reminds me of the former Senator Bob Dole, who after being wounded in World War II and losing the use of his right hand, still went on to a distinguished career in the Senate and become a candidate for both vice president and president. He also did ads for Pepsi and Viagra, but that's another story. Now, while I'm sure he would still love to regain use of his hand, I'm sure also that he would not consider it a matter of life and death, or something that couldn't wait a few hours if necessary, which was precisely the Pharisees' point. The guy could wait until the Sabbath passed. But Jesus blows off their concerns by asking, I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or destroy it? He likens the allowed practice of saving life to his act of doing good, and he then proceeds to heal the man's hand. We're told the Pharisees went ballistic and began to plot against Jesus. Now, some people say that this was a silly act of overreaction by a bunch of hidebound fundamentalists. But in fairness, we need to remember that Jesus was claiming an extraordinary degree of authority and seemed to be flouting what they saw as God's commandments, even if he was actually challenging their interpretation of those commandments. They worried that this jumped-up woodchopper was going to make all sorts of wild claims about his divine authority and perhaps lead people seriously astray, or maybe into a bloody confrontation with Rome, either by design or accident. Or he might just prove to be another loony who would con people out of what little they had with claims that he could bless them with wealth and power in return. Not like that's never happened. They saw Jesus as a loose cannon. He was having to walk a fine line between the stifling hyper-piety of a religious style filled with oppressive rules that became a crushing burden, and a freewheeling spirituality which pretty much does whatever feels good and conveniently assumes that God blesses it for that very reason. Fearful that Jesus was either a demagogue or a con man or both, the Pharisees started plotting against him. Jesus, in the meantime, moves on to name his top 12 students or disciples. We know next to nothing about their backgrounds, but none of them were particularly prominent or powerful. None were rich or well-connected. Many, if not most, were simple fishermen. There's Simon, whom he would nickname the Rock. In Aramaic, the language of Galilee, it was Kepha, usually translated as Cephas. And in Greek, the language of the New Testament, it was Petros, translated as Peter. There was Simon's brother Andrew. And there were their fishing business partners, James and John. There was another disciple, also named James, who was identified as the son of Alphaeus. The Gospel of Mark says that a man named Alphaeus was the father of the disciple Matthew, the former tax collector. But there's no reference to the two men being brothers. Little is known about Philip and Bartholomew, though they are always referred to together, indicating that they may have been related, though that's not certain. Thaddeus is another disciple about whom little is said or known. Thomas will become known through John's Gospel as the disciple who initially doubted Jesus' resurrection. There is another Simon in the bunch, described as a zealot. The Zealots were anti-Roman insurgents who engaged in guerrilla warfare and assassination of Roman officials and collaborators. Those collaborators would have included tax collectors like Matthew. And so you had two men who came together from opposite ends of the political spectrum who were brought together by a common allegiance to Jesus. I'm guessing that this caused suspicion among many people. The Zealots would have seen Matthew in Jesus' inner circle and noted that Simon the Zealot had given up his efforts to spark a violent insurrection against Rome, which may have led them to suspect that Jesus was a tool or an ally of the Romans. Meanwhile, the Romans and their supporters would have seen Matthew, who gave up his job as a tax collector, palling around with Simon the Zealot, which could have led them to suspect that Jesus was out to undermine Roman power. Jesus would end up being targeted by both sides in this bloody confrontation. Then finally there was Judas Iscariot, which may have come from the Hebrew name Ish Kiriot, which means man of Kiriot, which was a town in Judea. If this is the proper understanding of the term, it meant that Judas was a non-Galilean. It is possible that the term Iscariot comes from the word Sicarii, which was the name of a group of zealot assassins. The term meant dagger men, and they were especially bloodthirsty. If this is the source of the term Iscariot, and that's by no means certain, then Judas may well have betrayed Jesus because he felt that Jesus was not revolutionary enough. Or perhaps he hoped his arrest would trigger a general uprising against the Romans. Suffice it to say that even his choice of disciples would cause various groups to respond with alarm. It was a dangerous time, and people often responded to someone who didn't fit neatly into their preconceived notions and categories with hostility and suspicion. Rather like today. Many a pastor has experienced a similar dynamic when he or she arrives at a new church and begins to change things in ways that the various interest groups in the congregation feel challenges their power and familiar traditions. There aren't many of us who haven't had someone at some time get up a petition to have us removed because we've done something which they were sure was going to be the undoing of the church. Frankly, I'm convinced that if no one is threatened by what you're doing, you're not doing anything. Jesus was facing an infinitely more dangerous challenge in which groups who were mortal enemies to each other all felt threatened by him and would end up cooperating to destroy him. Ironically, he was the one person who was out to save them all. Of course, the problem has always been our assumption that the way to save the world is for everybody else to change. In our next episode of CyberBible 2.0, we will look at the blessings and the warnings Jesus offers and how they challenge the status quo, then and now. I'm Bob Morwell, pastor of Union United Methodist Church in Quincy, Illinois, and this is CyberBible 2.0. Peace.